Hi everybody. Today we're going to be discussing the use of lines within ceramics. We don't usually think about it in those terms. When we think about it, we usually think about if we're putting lines on a piece of paper, okay? But we're going to be thinking about it a little bit differently, okay? So I want us to just start out thinking about it in 4 different ways, okay? And how we might want to utilize that in our ceramics. Okay, we can talk more extensively about this, but let's just keep it to these 4s for the time being, just to keep everybody on the same page. So if we break down line and the use of line in ceramic work, first thing we're going to want to talk about is horizontal lines. What does that mean, the use of horizontal lines in ceramics? So when we think about a horizontal line, it gives us a sense of motionless, security, peaceful feelings. So if we look out at the ocean and we see the sort of wave lines, it gives us that sense of peace and excitement, right? There's just that beautiful, restful feelings. And so those are horizontal lines, okay? If we think about vertical lines, we think about grandeur, right? Something grand. You know, think about the Sears Towers. It sort of rises up with those vertical lines, that sense of grandeur, or a cathedral maybe in Europe. It also has a sense of spirituality or defiance. Okay, so again, that's a really good example of those vertical lines. When those two things come in combination, okay, vertical and horizontal lines, which is sort of the third way we want to think about it, it represents stability or strength, okay? And again, we could use those really well in combination. And our fourth way that we want to think about lines is the diagonal line. Now, a diagonal line gives a sense of movement. It gives a sense of energy, fluidity, and drama, all right? Now, I'm going to go ahead and show you some different pieces of ceramics within my house that sort of speaks to the use of different line qualities. So the first one I want to show you is Jeff Oestreich's piece, all right? I think it's Oestreich's piece. He's a studio potter up in Minnesota. You can even go visit him. He's a really nice guy. I had sent him a letter for wanting to get one of his peak pictures is what they're called. And he sent me a letter and did some drawings and had some examples, and I picked this one out. So let's kind of break this down in terms of the use of line. But before we do that, I want us to talk a little bit about those, reinforce some of those things that we've discussed earlier. One is universal forms, right? And 2, repetition. So if we take a look at this piece, the first most present universal form that you see is the rectangle, right? And if we look even further, there's little rectangles. And within this, we see the use of repetition. Repetition of lines, repetition of these, right? Okay, so let's get back to the use of line. The first line that we're going to see are those horizontal lines. So if we look, we see one here, we see one here, we see one here, one here, and one here. So that use of repetition of those lines are really clear, right? Those lines give us that sense of peaceful and restfulness, okay? He's also using vertical lines, okay? So while we have this rectangle, we have vertical lines right here. They're going up, see? And they're giving that sense of defiance or grandeur in combination. And there's actually a third line that is being used within this particular piece. So if we look at this, we can take a look at the spout and how it comes in, how it touches this way, and we get this diagonal. And again, that gives a sense, a feeling of drama. So there's a lot of different stuff going with where the use of line is within this particular piece. This is kind of a fun piece. What I really like about it is it's just another example of how to use the potter's wheel, okay? The potter's wheel, so if we look at it, it's just a narrow piece. So he throws a cylinder, no bottom, folds it, and then be able to create this piece, okay? So that's kind of a fun one. All right, so that's a good example where we see kind of everything in combination, okay? But let's break it down into a few more simpler things. So remember when we talked about those horizontal lines that give that sense of restfulness, peacefulness, motionless? Let me show you this piece. Now, this is an Ellen Shankin lidded jar, another great example of wheel-thrown ceramics. Nice, it's one of her pagoda jars. She also is a studio artist. But if we take a look at this, we're going to notice that there are a series of horizontal lines, right? Again, it gives a sense of peacefulness, restfulness, okay? And non-moving, right? It's a very static shape. You know, when we think of static, we think that's not an interesting term to use, but it just means really non-moving, eternal. And so this is a really good example of a use of horizontal lines. I got a little piece. Some of you guys know the types of stuff that I make. I just happen to have one sitting around the house. And if we take a look at this, I use this. I've got these nice horizontal lines. They move a little bit like water. But again, there's those feelings of restfulness, peacefulness, right? Just very soothing to the soul. So a good example of how we might want to use those horizontal lines. Let's talk a little bit about the second thing, okay, which was vertical lines. And when we think about vertical lines, we want to think about grandeur, right? That's probably a really great word to use, spirituality or defiance. And so when we think about grandeur, I want to show you a teapot that I have, which is Sam Chung's, okay? He actually does these with slab built. I think it's just a really beautiful piece. But do you get a sense of that grandeur that we're talking about? Again, like those cathedrals. Do you see a reference to architecture? Do you see how defiant it is? And we're going to see the use of these sort of, here we've got this vertical line. We've got a vertical line here, but it's really this big one here, as well as these guys, that really sort of get that piece to jump out a little bit in terms of using those vertical lines, okay? The next piece I want to show you is the use of vertical lines. A little bit, they got a little bit of a curve, but I still think they're important enough that you can really get a sense for it, and we'll notice these lines right here. Again, that real good sense of grandeur, spirituality, a little bit of a curve. The form itself is a good solid rectangle, right? And within that form, we've got that sense of grandeur. Now, we've seen the use of combinations, right? I've shown you the Jeff Oestreich's piece that uses both vertical and horizontal lines. And again, it represents stability, okay? And so that's a good thing to think about. And so last thing I kind of want to cover is sort of diagonal lines, okay? So ceramics, we aren't really thinking a lot about those diagonal lines. And again, what does diagonal lines help to do in ceramics? It gives it a sense of movement. It gives it a sense of trauma. It gives it a sense of energy. Now you say to yourself, well, how can I have a ceramic piece that gives a sense of movement? I mean, it's not going to move anywhere, right? I mean, it's going to, unless people are physically moving this object, I can't get that sense of movement from that. But not really. You can use a sense of movement. And so I have a piece I'd like to show you where we can really get you to understand that that's one of the things that we're talking about. So if we take a look at this piece, okay, this is Brad Schweiger. I think he teaches at the University of Ohio. And he soda fires these. So these are really sort of a gorgeous piece, right? There's a sense of lusciousness there. But getting back to that, do you see those diagonal lines? Doesn't that piece look like it's sort of moving a bit? It gives that sense of twirling, almost like those things that burrow in the ground, they got that, they go down and they sort of make that a really good sense of movement. So let's put this guy over here. And another good example of line, okay? Another good use of diagonal lines. And again, we see these diagonal lines this way. We also notice we've got a nice diagonal line happening here throughout the spout. This is Gail Smith's piece. Okay, again, a nice good example of wheel thrown. I think everything I've shown you except for Sam Chung's piece have been wheel thrown in some way. And when we look at this particular piece, again, there's a really good sense of drama that's happening here. So line can be used really nicely. These are what we want to consider lines within forms. Okay, so we have a form, which is this sort of, again, if we're talking about universal forms, you've sort of got that triangle look that's happening there, and again, the use of repetition. These lines are represented within this one big form, okay? And so for you guys, I'm just going to, as we get to learn technology, I get a little more comfortable in front of the camera, I'm going to have you guys do some different types of exercises. We're going to be learning in different ways. What I want you to do is give me 10 sketches that relate to line in some way. And again, we want to break it down into those sort of 4 categories, okay? So the use of horizontal lines, vertical lines, maybe in combinations or diagonal lines. And then just do a little sketch. I don't really have a lot of paper here, so I would normally probably have a whiteboard here and kind of draw some stuff out for you, but I don't have access to that right now. But if you got a piece of paper, give me 10 sketches that uses line in some way. Because I think the exciting thing about this is going to give us a time, instead of just getting in the studio and doing stuff, it's going to give us this opportunity to really think more strategically when we do get back into our studio, ways to sort of approach making stuff. Hopefully as we move down, I might be able to even try to get myself into the studio. Probably not, but I have another studio that I might be able to utilize. I'm kind of looking into it. But until that time, let's do some different types of assignments. I think I'm also going to give you a link to a really cool video that, again, Jeff's piece, that explains a little bit about his history and stuff. So again, for next class, shoot some emails through me through D2L. So take a picture of your 10 sketches and then do a little write-up of how you're using line off to the side and email it to me through D2L. Okay, we're going to just take baby steps here. All right, so have a really good day, and I'm looking forward to seeing your work.